They said Esther's stitches were so fine you could barely see them, until the morning Doña Catalina's Sunday dress began to burn. Cartagena in 1789 was a city of white stone and salt air, where colonial houses leaned against each other like tired soldiers, their courtyards thick with jasmine and rot. The Garcia household sat 3 streets from the harbor, close enough to hear the bells of San Pedro Claver, but far enough that the fish market stench only reached them on humid nights. Inside its walls, 12 enslaved souls kept the household running: cooks, washers, porters, and Esther, the seamstress whose hands the mistress called God's own gift whenever guests admired her embroidery. Esther had sewn for Doña Catalina for 11 years. She knew every measurement, every preference, every vanity. The mistress liked her collars high, her sleeves tight at the wrist, her hems weighted with lead so they wouldn't lift in the wind. Esther's workroom was a converted storage closet off the kitchen courtyard, lit by a single window that faced the servants' quarters. In the mornings, the room smelled of beeswax and thread. By afternoon, it smelled of blood. The dress that killed Doña Catalina was pale yellow silk, ordered for the feast of Santa Rosa de Lima. It took Esther 3 weeks to complete. Hand-stitched seams, Belgian lace at the bodice, seed pearls along the neckline. She worked alone, as always, her needle catching the light like a compass pointing north. No one asked why she requested extra fabric for the lining. No one wondered why she spent her evenings grinding oleander leaves in the garden after dark, or why she visited the apothecary's back door on market days, trading her bread ration for dried manchineel bark. Because in the Garcia house, the seamstress was invisible, until she wasn't. The story of how Esther came to sew poison into silk begins not with thread, but with rope. With a morning in July when Doña Catalina ordered a 12-year-old girl named Rosa tied to the courtyard post for breaking a porcelain cup. Esther had been sewing in her workroom when she heard the screams. She watched through her window as the overseer raised the whip, as Rosa's mother collapsed to her knees as Doña Catalina stood in the shade of the veranda, fanning herself, counting aloud to 20. When it was over, the mistress returned to her parlor. The blood stayed on the stones for 3 days, baking in the Caribbean sun, until the rains finally washed it toward the drains. Rosa died of infection 2 weeks later. Her mother stopped speaking. And Esther, who had sewn the mistress's mourning black for her father, her wedding gown, her daughter's baptism dress, picked up her needle with different hands. This is not a story of sudden rage or desperate fury. This is the story of preparation, of a woman who understood that dignity could be stitched into cloth, that justice could be measured in grains, that silence was the strongest thread of all. In Cartagena's heat, where the trade winds carried rumors from ship to shore, where every household hid its cruelties behind whitewashed walls, Esther's revenge would be sewn so carefully that even God might mistake it for devotion. The dress was ready by August. The feast was set for the last Sunday of the month. And in her workroom, Esther threaded her needle one final time, whispering a prayer that sounded like a promise. Chapter 1. The Yellow Silk. The commission arrived on the first Monday of August, delivered by Doña Catalina herself, who swept into Esther's workroom, trailing perfume and impatience. "Yellow," the mistress announced, dropping a bolt of silk onto the work table. "Imported from Seville. The seamstress in Bogotá charges double what I pay you, and her stitches are half as fine. I want something that makes the Viuda de Mendoza weep with envy. High collar, fitted waist, Belgian lace if we can afford it. The feast of Santa Rosa is 3 weeks away." Esther stood with her hands folded, her eyes on the floor. "Yes, Doña." "Don't ruin it." Catalina's fan snapped open. "I've told Don Emilio you're the best seamstress in Cartagena. Don't embarrass me." The door closed. The perfume lingered. Esther waited until the mistress's footsteps faded into the main house before she touched the silk. It was heavy, expensive, the kind of fabric that caught sunlight and held it. The color reminded her of jaundice, of the fever that had taken Rosa, of the way the girl's eyes had yellowed in her final days. Esther spread the fabric across her table, smoothing it with calloused palms. She had learned her trade from her mother, who had learned it from hers. 3 generations of women whose fingers had dressed Spanish ladies for masses, weddings, and funerals. Her mother used to say that a good seamstress could read a woman's soul through her measurements. Doña Catalina's soul, Esther had learned, was the exact width of vanity and the precise length of cruelty. The work began that afternoon. Esther cut the pattern with scissors her mother had sharpened on the stones behind the kitchen. She marked the seams with chalk, planned the darts, measured twice. In the Garcia household, mistakes were punished. A crooked hem meant no supper. A missed stitch meant the lash. Perfection was survival. But this dress would be perfect for different reasons. That evening, after the dinner dishes were cleared and the main house shuttered for the night, Esther walked to the garden behind the servants' quarters. The space was small, shadowed by banana trees and choked with weeds, but it grew what she needed. Oleander bushes lined the back wall, their pink flowers innocent in the moonlight. She had been tending them for months, watering them with kitchen scraps, pruning them so they grew thick. She picked 12 leaves, folding them into her apron. In the tool shed, using a stone mortar she'd stolen from the kitchen, she ground them into paste. The work was slow, careful. Oleander was patient poison. It took time, accumulation, the steady building of toxin in the blood. 1 dose meant nausea. 2 meant fever. 3 meant the heart would stop trying. By midnight, she had enough paste to line a handkerchief. She wrapped it in cloth, hid it beneath her sleeping mat, and lay awake listening to the insects hum in the heat. Somewhere in the main house, Doña Catalina slept in her canopied bed, dreaming of yellow silk and the envy of widows. Esther did not dream. She counted stitches in the dark. The next morning, she returned to her workroom before dawn. The yellow silk waited like a question. She began with the bodice, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with the rhythm of prayer. Each stitch was identical, invisible, the mark of a woman who had spent 11 years making herself indispensable. The other servants called her La Silenciosa, the silent one, because she spoke only when spoken to, kept her eyes down, and never questioned orders. But silence was not the same as obedience. Silence was the thread that held everything together until the moment it was cut. By the end of the first week, the bodice was complete. Esther fitted it to the dress form in the corner of her workroom, a wooden mannequin shaped exactly like Doña Catalina's measurements. The mistress inspected it twice, running her fingers along the seams, checking for imperfections. She found none. "Acceptable," Catalina said, which was the closest she came to praise. "The sleeves next, and don't skimp on the lace." Esther nodded, waited, watched the mistress leave. Then she returned to the garden, to the oleander, to the slow work of grinding leaves into powder. The poison was bitter, green, the color of jealousy itself. She mixed it with beeswax to make it stick, then applied it to the inside lining of the bodice, the part that would press directly against skin, that would warm with body heat, that would seep into pores over hours of wear. 1 application would not be enough. She needed 3, maybe 4, spread across the weeks of construction. Each layer absorbed into the silk like memory into bone. Above her, the bells of San Pedro Claver rang for evening mass. The sound carried across the rooftops, echoing off stone, reminding the city that God was watching. Esther listened to the bells and thought of Rosa, of the blood on the courtyard stones, of the way Doña Catalina had counted to 20 without flinching. Then she picked up her needle and returned to work. The dress was taking shape, beautiful, deadly, and inevitable as tide. Chapter 2. The Ledger. The second week of August brought rain, heavy, sudden storms that turned the streets to mud and sent the household scrambling to close shutters. Esther worked through the thunder, her needle steady even when lightning cracked close enough to rattle the window glass. She had finished the sleeves and begun the skirt, each panel falling in perfect pleats, each hem weighted with precision. But the dress was only part of the plan. In the Garcia household, every act of cruelty was recorded. Not officially, Don Emilio kept no ledgers of punishments, no logs of lashes, but in the memories of those who survived them. Esther had been keeping her own accounting for years. Dates, offenses, consequences. She recorded them in her mind the way her mother had taught her to memorize prayer, repeating them each night before sleep until they became permanent. July 14, 1789, Rosa, 12 years old, 20 lashes for breaking a cup, dead 2 weeks later. March 3, 1788, Samuel, the cook's son, sold to a plantation in the interior after he looked at the mistress's daughter too long. November 22, 1787, Maria, the washwoman, branded on the forearm for attempting to visit her sister in the market without permission. The list went on, a catalog of casual violence, each entry another stitch in the fabric of injustice that held the household together. Esther knew she could not avenge them all, but she could avenge one, and in doing so she could prove that silence was not the same as submission. On Wednesday morning, the mistress summoned her to the parlor. Doña Catalina sat in her cushioned chair by the window, embroidery hoop in her lap, pretending to work. She never finished anything she started. That was Esther's job. "The dress?" Catalina said, without looking up. "How far?" "The skirt is half finished, Doña. The lace will take another week." "You have 10 days. The feast is the 28th. If it's not ready, I'll have you whipped in the courtyard where everyone can watch. I've been too soft with you. The others are starting to think I show favoritism." Esther kept her face blank. "Yes, Doña." "And Esther?" The mistress finally looked at her, eyes sharp as scissors. "Make sure the fit is perfect. I want every woman at that feast to hate me for how I look." "Of course, Doña." The interview ended. Esther returned to her workroom, her hands shaking only after she closed the door. Anger was a luxury she could not afford. Not yet. First came preparation. First came the slow, patient work of weaving poison into beauty. That afternoon, during the servants' meal, she sat next to old Tomas, the porter who had worked for the Garcia family for 30 years. He was half blind now, his back bent from decades of carrying furniture and supplies up the narrow stairs from the harbor. But his memory was perfect. "Tomas," she said quietly, spooning rice onto his plate. "Do you remember the apothecary on Calle del Arsenal? The one who sells herbs in the back?" He nodded slowly. "Portuguese man. Don't ask questions if you pay in silver. What does he sell besides medicine?" Tomas turned his clouded eyes toward her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, manchineel bark, henbane seeds, aconite root if you know what to ask for. Why? Curiosity. Curiosity kills, Esther. So does obedience. He smiled, a sad pulling at the corners of his mouth. Your mother used to say that, right before they sold her away from here. Esther felt the words like a needle through skin. She had been 10 years old when her mother disappeared, bought by a merchant heading to Jamaica. She had cried for 3 days. Doña Catalina had threatened to sell her too if she didn't stop making noise. The Portuguese apothecary, Esther said. Does he open on Sundays? Back door only, after Mass. She thanked him with a touch to his shoulder, the only affection permitted between them, and returned to her workroom. The yellow silk glowed in the afternoon light, already half poisoned, already halfway to justice. But oleander alone would not be enough. It was too slow, too uncertain. She needed something stronger for the final layer, something that would guarantee the dress did what words and prayers could not. That Sunday, while the Garcia family attended Mass at San Pedro Claver, Esther slipped out the servants' entrance and walked 3 streets to the apothecary. The heat was brutal, the kind that made stones sweat and dogs lie still in whatever shadow they could find. She knocked on the back door twice, waited, knocked again. The Portuguese man who answered was younger than she expected, with ink-stained fingers and a careful way of looking that suggested he knew exactly why people came to his back entrance. Medicine? He asked in Spanish. Manchineel bark, Esther said. Ground fine. He studied her for a moment. That's not medicine. I didn't say it was. 2 reales. She handed him the coins, money she had saved from mending clothes for other servants, a lifetime of careful hoarding. He disappeared into the shop's dark interior, returning with a small cloth pouch. 1 pinch will blister skin, he said. 2 will burn through to bone. 3 will stop a heart if it's absorbed long enough. Don't touch it with bare hands. Esther took the pouch, tucked it into her bodice. I'm a seamstress. I know how to be careful. Then be careful of this. They hang seamstresses who poison their mistresses. Only if they find proof. She left before he could respond, walking quickly through the empty streets back toward the Garcia house. The bells had stopped ringing. Mass would be over soon. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the family returned. In her workroom, she opened the pouch and mixed a pinch of manchineel bark with the oleander paste, creating a substance that looked like nothing more than stiffener for collar stays. She applied it to the inside of the high collar she had just finished, the part that would rest directly against Doña Catalina's neck, that would absorb her sweat, that would press into her skin for hours during the feast. The substance dried clear, invisible, perfect. Esther cleaned her tools, hid the pouch beneath her mattress, and returned to her sewing. By the time she heard the family's carriage rattle into the courtyard, she had finished 3 more inches of hem, her hands steady, her face composed. That night, lying on her mat in the servants' quarters, she listened to the others breathe in the darkness. Someone was crying softly, one of the younger girls, homesick or heartsick or just sick of being owned. Esther wanted to comfort her, but didn't. Comfort was another luxury she couldn't afford. Not until the dress was finished. Not until Doña Catalina wore it to the feast, admired by all, envied by everyone, dying by inches while the whole city watched. Justice, Esther had learned, was patient as needlework. It took time to stitch together, but once it was complete, it held forever. Chapter 3. The Fitting. The 3rd week of August arrived with heat so thick it felt like cloth pressed against the face. In the Garcia household, the daily routines continued unchanged. Morning sweeping, afternoon cooking, evening prayers. Esther bent over her yellow silk, her needle catching light, her mind counting stitches and doses and the days remaining until the feast. 13 days, then 12, then 11. On Tuesday, Doña Catalina summoned her for the first fitting. The mistress stood in her dressing room, chemise loosened, fan working steadily, while Esther lifted the half-finished dress over her head. The bodice settled into place perfectly, every dart, every seam exactly where it should be. Esther pinned the skirt panels, marked where the waist would cinch, stepped back to observe. "Well," Catalina demanded, studying herself in the standing mirror. "It fits, Doña. The final hem will take 3 more days. The lace, I don't care about the lace, I care about how I look." The mistress turned, preening, her hands running over the silk. "Will it make the Viuda de Mendoza jealous?" "It will make her weep, Doña." Catalina smiled, a rare expression that made her look almost human. Almost. "Good. That's what I'm paying you for. Now help me out of this before I sweat through it." Esther unfastened the back carefully, her fingers brushing the poisoned lining she'd spent weeks preparing. The manchineel paste had absorbed completely into the fabric, invisible and patient. In 3 days, it would have another layer. In 6 days, a third. By the time Doña Catalina wore the finished dress to the feast, the collar alone would carry enough toxin to make her skin blister, her throat swell, her heart struggle through every beat. But poison needed time, and time needed routine. After the fitting, Esther returned to her workroom and discovered that someone had been watching her. A sewing needle lay on the floor near the door, not one of hers. She picked it up, examined it. Cheap iron, poorly made, the kind the washwomen used for mending sheets. Someone had dropped it on purpose, marking that they'd been there. Esther's stomach tightened. The household had informants, servants who traded whispers for extra bread or lighter work. If someone suspected, if anyone had seen her in the garden, grinding oleander, or noticed her Sunday absence, a knock at the door. Esther slipped the needle into her apron and opened it. Maria stood in the doorway, the washwoman who had been branded 3 years earlier. Her left forearm still bore the scar, a C for the Garcia family name, burned deep enough to never fade. She was 40, maybe older, with hands like leather from years of scrubbing. "May I come in?" Maria asked. Esther stepped aside, closed the door. "I saw you," Maria said quietly, "at the apothecary 2 Sundays ago. I was bringing laundry to the widow on Calle del Arsenal." Silence filled the small room like humidity. Esther's hand moved toward the scissors on her work table, not as threat, but as reflex. The instinct of someone who had learned survival meant being ready for betrayal. "What do you want?" Esther asked. "To help you finish." "I don't know what you're talking about." Maria pulled up her sleeve, showing the brand. "She did this because I wanted to see my sister who I hadn't seen in 4 years, who was dying of fever in a shack near the fish market. I asked permission to visit her one afternoon, just one. And Doña Catalina said, 'Slaves don't have sisters. Slaves have work.'" Esther said nothing. "My sister died alone," Maria continued, her voice flat, factual. "I wasn't there to hold her hand or pray with her or close her eyes, because this woman, this mistress in her fine dresses, decided my labor was worth more than my love." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because whatever you're sewing into that yellow dress, you're not the only one who wants to see her wear it." The two women looked at each other. Around them, the household hummed with afternoon routine. Footsteps in the corridor, voices from the kitchen, the distant sound of Don Emilio's study door closing. The world pretending normalcy while inside this small room, justice was being negotiated in whispers. "If I were doing something," Esther said carefully, "it would be dangerous to know about it." "We're already in danger," Maria replied. "Every day we wake up in this house is dangerous. At least this danger has purpose." Esther considered. She had planned everything alone, trusting no one, because trust was another thing servants couldn't afford. But Maria was right. And more importantly, Maria had information Esther needed. "Does she eat beforehand?" Esther asked. "Before church feasts?" "Always. A small meal in her room, bread, cheese, wine. She doesn't like eating in public. Says it makes her look common." "Who brings it to her?" "I do," Maria said. "I've been her chambermaid for 6 years. I bring her breakfast, lay out her clothes, help her dress." Esther felt the pieces shifting, aligning. She had planned for the dress alone, for the slow absorption of poison through skin, for the hours of exposure during the feast. But if Maria brought her food, if wine could carry an extra dose, if the morning routine could ensure the toxin entered not just through skin, but through throat. "Manchineel bark," Esther said quietly. "Mixed with wine it tastes bitter, but mixed with honey and cinnamon it disappears. How much would you need?" "Half a spoonful." In her breakfast wine, the morning of the feast. Maria nodded slowly. "And the dress will do the rest?" "The collar, the lining, the seams, all of it. By the time Mass ends, she'll feel warm. By the time they serve dinner at the feast, she'll be nauseous. By sunset, her heart will be racing. By midnight, Maria finished, she'll be dead." They stood in silence. Outside, the afternoon bells rang for none, the prayers that divided the day into manageable pieces. Esther thought of Rosa, of the courtyard stones, of the way Doña Catalina had counted lashes like blessings. She thought of her mother, sold away, of Samuel, branded, of Maria's sister, dying alone. "If we do this," Esther said, "there can be no hesitation, no second thoughts. If she survives, we hang." "If she survives," Maria replied, "we were dead anyway. At least this way we die with purpose." They sealed the agreement with a nod, no handshake, no oath, nothing that could be witnessed or remembered. Maria left first, returning to her laundry. Esther waited 5 minutes, then opened her window to let in air that smelled of rain and salt and possibility. That night, she added another layer of manchineel paste to the dress collar. Her hands were steady. Her conscience was clear. Above the city, thunder rolled in from the Caribbean, and Cartagena braced for storms that never quite arrived. If you're still watching, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and how this story found you. Chapter 4. The lace 9 days before the feast. Esther began the final detail work. The Belgian lace that would frame the neckline and cuffs of Doña Catalina's yellow dress. The lace had arrived from Bogotá 3 days late, forcing her to work by candlelight long after the household slept. Each stitch had to be invisible, the attachment so seamless that the lace appeared to grow naturally from the silk. She worked alone, as always, but now she worked with the knowledge that someone else knew, that Maria was waiting, preparing, counting down the same days toward the same Sunday. The secret sat between them like a third presence whenever they passed in corridors or shared space in the kitchen courtyard. Neither spoke of it, neither needed to. On Thursday, the household received news that made Esther's hands pause over her needle. The feast of Santa Rosa had been expanded. Not just the usual families, but the governor's wife, the bishop's secretary, and 3 merchant families from Spain, who were considering investments in Cartagena's port expansion. Doña Catalina was ecstatic. "Everyone will be there," she announced at the servants' evening meal, her voice carrying from the dining room where the family ate. "Everyone who matters in this city will see me in that dress." "Esther, is it finished?" Esther appeared in the doorway, head bowed. 2 days more, Doña. The lace requires— I don't care what it requires. I need it perfect. If a single thread is loose, if a single stitch shows, I'll have you sold to the mines in Antioquia. Do you understand? Yes, Doña. Back in her workroom, Esther's hands trembled, not from fear but from rage so pure it felt like fever. The mines in Antioquia were death sentences. Women lasted 6 months, maybe a year, before the heat and dust and endless labor broke them. It was the threat the mistress used when whippings weren't enough, when she wanted to remind her property that there were always worse places to be owned. Esther forced her hand still and returned to the lace. Each attachment point had to be reinforced twice, once with regular thread, once with silk thread that matched the dress exactly. The work was meditative, repetitive, the kind that allowed thoughts to drift while fingers remembered their training. She thought about Rosa's mother, who still hadn't spoken since her daughter's death, about Samuel, who would be cutting sugarcane somewhere in the interior, his childhood erased, about the casual way Doña Catalina had just threatened her with death, as easily as ordering wine. Around midnight, Maria appeared at her door with coffee. The bitter, chicory-stretched coffee the servants drank when the family's imported beans ran out. "You should sleep," Maria said, setting the cup on the work table. "I can't. 2 days left. The dress is beautiful. It's meant to be." Esther gestured to the yellow silk spread across her table, the lace now attached to the bodice, the skirt panels waiting to be assembled. In candlelight, the dress glowed like captured sunlight, like hope made fabric, like revenge dressed in elegance. Maria ran a finger along the collar's edge, the poisoned part, though she didn't know exactly where the toxin was concentrated. "How do you stand it?" she asked, working so carefully on something meant for her. "Every stitch is a prayer," Esther said. "Every seam is a promise. What are you praying for?" "Justice that looks like accident, suffering that seems like illness, death that arrives wearing the face of God's will." Maria smiled grimly. "The manchineel bark, I have it. Tomas helped me grind it finer, mixed with honey from the kitchen. It's in a small bottle hidden in my apron. On Sunday morning I'll add it to her breakfast wine." "How much?" "Enough to make her thirsty, to make her sweat. The dress will do the rest, won't it?" "The dress will finish what the wine begins." They fell silent. Outside, the night sounds of Cartagena filtered through the window. Distant voices, a dog barking, the ever-present whisper of wind from the harbor. The city was sleeping, unaware that in this small room, 2 women were plotting the death of one of its most prominent ladies, not with daggers or obvious poison, but with needle and thread and the patient accumulation of toxin. "Do you think she'll suffer?" Maria asked. "I think she'll feel what Rosa felt," Esther replied. "Burning skin, racing heart, the sense that her body is betraying her. The difference is, Rosa was innocent. Doña Catalina has earned every second of it." "And after? When they find her dead, the physician will call it heart failure, or fever, or the heat. Rich women die from unexplained ailments all the time. They'll bury her in the cathedral, say prayers for her soul, and within a month, Don Emilio will remarry. The household will continue. We'll still be owned. But she'll be gone. But she'll be gone, Esther agreed. And that's enough. Maria left without another word. Esther returned to her lace, working through the remainder of the night. By dawn, the bodice was complete. Every stitch perfect, every thread invisible, the collar lined with enough poison to burn through skin over the course of a long Sunday mass and feast. She held it up to the growing light, examining her work with the critical eye of a woman who had been trained to see flaws invisible to others. There were none. The dress was flawless, deadly, ready. She spent Friday assembling the skirt panels, attaching them to the bodice, finishing the hem with the lead weights that would keep it from lifting in church breezes. Saturday she dedicated to final pressing, to checking every seam, to ensuring that nothing, absolutely nothing, would draw attention away from the dress's beauty toward its purpose. On Saturday evening, Doña Catalina came for the final inspection. She arrived with Don Emilio, who rarely entered the servants' quarters, but who wanted to see what his wife had commissioned. Esther stood beside the dress form, hands folded, while they circled it like buyers examining livestock. "Extraordinary," Don Emilio said, which was the first time he'd ever spoken directly to Esther. "You have real talent, girl. Perhaps we should loan you out to other families. There's profit in skilled work." Loan, not pay, not free. Loan, as if Esther were equipment to be rented by the hour. "The lace is perfect," Doña Catalina said, running her fingers over the collar, over the poison Esther had so carefully woven into every thread. "And the color. Yes, this will make them all jealous. Good work, Esther. You won't be punished this time." This time. As if punishment were the default, kindness the exception. "Thank you, Doña. Have it ready by Sunday morning. Mass begins at 9. I'll need an hour to dress beforehand. It will be ready." They left. Esther waited until their footsteps faded, until she was certain she was alone, before she allowed herself to breathe. One more night. One more morning. Then the dress would leave her hands and enter history. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in her workroom, the yellow silk glowing in moonlight, and thought about justice. About how it arrived not in thunder but in careful preparation. About how the powerful never expected the powerless to fight back with patience, with planning, with the very skills they had forced their slaves to learn. Doña Catalina had made Esther the best seamstress in Cartagena, and now that skill would unmake her. When dawn broke on Sunday, Esther dressed in her cleanest work clothes and carried the yellow dress to the mistress's chambers. Maria was already there, laying out jewelry, preparing the breakfast tray. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. A confirmation, a commitment, a shared understanding that there was no turning back. The dress hung on its stand near the window, catching the first light of morning. Beautiful, perfect, patient as death itself. Chapter 5. The morning of the feast. Sunday arrived clear and bright, the kind of Caribbean morning that made Cartagena look like paradise. White buildings sharp against blue sky, trade winds carrying the smell of salt and coffee. Church bells beginning their call to Mass at San Pedro Claver. In the Garcia household, the servants rose before dawn to prepare the family for the feast of Santa Rosa de Lima. Esther dressed in darkness, her hands steady as she plaited her hair and tied her work apron. This was the day. After weeks of planning, grinding, stitching, waiting, after years of swallowing rage and surviving cruelty, this was the morning justice would be served at 8 in the morning. Delivered on a breakfast tray. She found Maria in the kitchen preparing Doña Catalina's meal. The tray held the usual: fresh bread from yesterday's baking, white cheese from the market, sliced mango, and a small crystal glass of wine mixed with water. The mistress believed diluted wine was healthy, civilized, the mark of Spanish refinement. This morning, it would be something else entirely. "Is it ready?" Esther whispered, standing close enough that no one else could hear. Maria's hand went to her apron pocket, where a small bottle waited. I'll add it just before I go upstairs. Tomas is keeping watch at the corridor entrance. If anyone comes, he'll cough twice. How much? Half a spoonful, like you said, mixed with honey and cinnamon. The wine already has spices. She'll never taste the difference. They stood together for a moment, two women who had survived years of brutality about to commit an act that would hang them if discovered. Around them, the kitchen hummed with Sunday preparation, the cook kneading dough for the feast later that afternoon, young girls peeling vegetables, the porter bringing fresh water from the well. Normal life, continuing as if this morning were like any other. When she's dressed, Esther said, when she's wearing the dress, stay close, watch for signs. If she feels faint before Mass, it's working. If she gets through Mass but struggles at the feast, the collar has done its work. Either way, by tonight, Maria finished. We'll know if we're free or dead. She picked up the tray, paused at the kitchen door. For Rosa, she said quietly. For Rosa, Esther agreed. And for all of us. Maria climbed the stairs to the mistress's chambers. Esther waited in the courtyard, ostensibly sweeping the stones but actually counting her own heartbeats, measuring time by the rhythm of anxiety and hope. From upstairs, she heard the murmur of voices. Maria greeting the mistress, setting down the tray, opening curtains to let in morning light. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then Maria appeared at the top of the stairs, descending with the empty tray. As she passed Esther in the courtyard, she whispered without stopping. She drank it all, said it tasted sweeter than usual. Esther's hands tightened on her broom. The first dose was in. Now the dress would multiply it, amplify it, turn a morning's discomfort into an afternoon's agony, into an evening's death. At 7:30, she carried the yellow dress upstairs herself. Doña Catalina stood by her window in her chemise, her hair already pinned by Maria, her face flushed. There you are, help me into it, carefully. If you snag the lace, I'll have you locked in the cellar for a week. Esther lifted the dress, felt its weight, felt the weeks of poison woven into every seam. She lowered it over the mistress's head, felt Catalina's shoulders stiffen as the bodice settled into place, as the poisoned collar pressed against her neck, as the lining made contact with skin that was already beginning to absorb the manchineel bark from the wine. It's tight, Catalina complained, tugging at the collar. It's meant to be fitted, Doña. That's the fashion. It's uncomfortable. Beauty requires sacrifice. The mistress turned to her mirror, studying herself. Despite her complaint, she looked magnificent. The yellow silk caught the light perfectly. The lace framed her face with elegant precision. The cut made her waist look impossibly small. She preened, turned, examined herself from every angle. Yes, she said finally. Yes, this is perfect. The Viuda de Mendoza will die of envy. Someone will die, Esther thought, but she kept her face neutral, her hands folded, her voice humble. You look beautiful, Doña. I know, now go. I don't want servants hovering while I finish dressing. Esther descended the stairs, returned to the courtyard where the other servants were gathering for the walk to Mass. The Garcia family always made a show of piety, Don Emilio leading, his wife beside him, their daughter behind, the servants following at a respectful distance. Today would be no different, except that by the time Mass ended, Doña Catalina would be sweating through her beautiful dress, her heart beginning to race, her skin starting to burn where the collar touched. The walk to San Pedro Claver took 15 minutes. Esther kept her eyes down, her mind counting. The wine would work quickly. Within an hour, the mistress would feel warm, slightly nauseous, her heart beating faster than normal. She would attribute it to excitement, to the heat, to the tightness of her dress. By the time Mass ended and the feast began, the symptoms would intensify. And by tonight, when the accumulated poison from wine, dress, and hours of contact had done its work, Doña Catalina's heart would simply stop trying. It would look like fever, like heat exhaustion, like the mysterious ailments that killed wealthy women in tropical climates. The physician would shake his head, prescribe bloodletting for the corpse, and accept his payment. Don Emilio would mourn appropriately, and within a month, life would continue. Except one less woman would be ordering lashes, threatening sales to mines, counting punishments like blessings. Inside San Pedro Claver, the church was already filling with Cartagena's finest families. The Garcia party was seated near the front, a mark of their status, while the servants stood in the back along the walls. Esther positioned herself where she could see the mistress, could watch for signs that the poison was working. The mass began, prayers in Latin, incense smoke, the priest's voice echoing off stone. Esther didn't follow the words. She followed Doña Catalina's posture, watched for the moment when the mistress would shift in her seat, tug at her collar, fan herself more urgently than the heat required. It came 20 minutes into the service. A small gesture, the mistress reaching up to touch her neck, pulling at the tight collar. Then another, 5 minutes later. Then a whisper to Don Emilio, who leaned close, nodded, whispered something back. Esther couldn't hear the words, but she could read the concern in his posture. Something was wrong. His wife was uncomfortable. By the time the priest raised the consecrated host, Doña Catalina was visibly struggling. Her face was flushed, her breathing rapid, her hand pressing against her chest. Don Emilio tried to help her stand for the final blessing, but she swayed, caught his arm, sat back down abruptly. Around them, other families began to notice. Whispers spread through the congregation like wind through grass. The mistress is ill. The heat. The excitement. Someone should open a window. But the windows were already open, and the heat was no worse than any other Sunday. What was wrong was inside Doña Catalina, spreading through her blood, tightening her throat, making her heart work double time to pump poison through her veins. When Mass finally ended, Don Emilio half-carried his wife out of the church, calling for their carriage, for water, for someone to fetch the physician. The feast would have to wait. His wife needed rest, needed air, needed whatever would stop this sudden illness that had struck her down in the middle of Mass. The carriage took them home. The servants followed on foot, Maria and Esther walking side by side, neither speaking, both watching the future unfold with the inevitability of sunrise. By the time they reached the Garcia house, Doña Catalina could barely walk. Don Emilio carried her to her chambers, shouting for Maria to bring cool water, for someone to summon the physician, for everyone to stay back while his wife recovered from this mysterious attack. Esther stood in the courtyard and listened to the chaos above. She felt no guilt, no fear, only a calm certainty that justice, once set in motion, would finish its work regardless of intervention. The yellow dress had been worn, the poison had been absorbed, and now there was nothing to do but wait for nightfall and the silence that follows when a heart finally gives up its struggle.